Hi, my name is Mabel Leon, and I'm going to take you on an adventure to Cuba today. I was on a trip to Cuba this May and June of 2022. But before I take you on this ride of a vibrant culture, I'm going to talk a little bit to give you a little background about Cuba because there tends to be so much misinformation. I'm going to start with the history of Cuba. Cuba was a Spanish colony from the 1500s all the way to 1898. And during that period, the colonists made a great deal of money on the backs of slaves. They imported 800,000 slaves to the island of Cuba, which is twice as many who were brought to the United States. They became very rich in the sugar industry, all on the backs of slaves. There were many, many struggles for independence, and slaves and also freed blacks fought very hard with people living in Cuba to get their independence. There was a great deal of violence, a great deal of poverty, and some really horrific conflicts. In 1898, in the Spanish-American War, Spain was extricated from the island of Cuba. But that did not mean that they had won their independence because they were a de facto colony of the United States. The United States government and United States corporation controlled 3/4 of the arable land in Cuba. They controlled 1/3 of the raw sugar industry. They controlled the telephone system, the electric system, the railroad system, and power refineries. And they installed one after another dictator to keep the people down. There was a revolution which tossed out Batista, the last dictator in Cuba, in 1959. And I'm going to talk about some of the conditions at that point and some of the accomplishments of Cuba. In 1959, the island had a great deal of poverty. 41% of the people that lived in the countryside were illiterate. 11% of the people that lived in cities were illiterate. So one of the first big things that the new government took on was a literacy campaign. And what they did is they trained high school students to go to the countryside and to parts of the city. They trained them in how to teach reading. And the literacy of Cuba was begun. Cuba is 100% literate at this point in their history. They have free education from preschool all the way through advanced degrees. That doesn't mean that everybody gets an advanced degree. Advanced degrees are for people academically talented who are choosing that path. But the average Cuban adult has 10 years of formal education, and illiteracy is 0. It is a literate, educated nation. In 1959, when they succeeded in taking over the country, there was very little medical care. The medical care that existed for people that were affluent and people that were middle class. Many of the doctors in Cuba fled after the revolution, feared for their livelihood. So Cuba had to begin creating a healthcare system from scratch. And the first thing that they did was create institutions to train doctors. And actually, they train doctors all over the world, and they still do. Their healthcare system is based on a system of family doctors, then what is called polyclinics, which are small health centers to deal with x-rays and diagnostic testing. And then there are hospitals, and there are very specialized hospitals. There is a lot of research that happens on healthcare in Cuba. So there are research institutions, and of course, the institutions to train health professionals. Cuba has been quite successful with their health system, even though they do not have access to many medications that they need, and they don't always have access to advanced equipment because there is a strangle on them with trade from the United States called the embargo, and I will talk about that later. But what I want to talk about now is there are certain things that are strong indicators for how a healthcare system is working in a country. One of those is how long do people live? And in Cuba, the longevity is longer than it is in the United States. Another indicator is infant mortality, the death of infants. The Cuba infant mortality is a lower rate than in the United States, but that doesn't mean that they have access to many of the medications that they do need. They send doctors, they train doctors and send doctors all over the world, doctors and other health professionals. They have responded to the Ebola disease, to COVID, and when there are national disasters. Since 1959, they have sent 132,000 health professionals to 106 countries. And I'm going to now talk about COVID, which has kind of disappeared from our conversation, but it was very present when I was in Cuba in May. There were 109 active cases in May, and 8,500 people had died, and 1 million people had recovered. Cuba created 5 different vaccines that were able to be maintained at room temperature, and they shared them with the global south and also with Italy. 90% of all the adults in Cuba received at least one vaccine, and all Cuban residents from the age of 2 to 18 were fully vaccinated. Okay, what I'm going to do now is talk about the embargo. The embargo is a set of trade sanctions that was established in 1960. It is the longest lasting trade sanctions that the United States have ever imposed on another government. And the goal of the embargo was to isolate Cuba from the rest of the world, and it literally was to create pain for the people living in Cuba so that they would rebel against their government. It has had a very negative effect on the economy of Cuba and on the lives of regular Cubans. It restricts exports and imports, and if any item has one item manufactured in the United States, Cuba is not allowed to buy it. Now, the trade sanctions have been lessened under some administrations, tightened under others, but the embargo has been in effect since 1960. Under President Obama, diplomatic relations were set up, but the embargo was still there. Under President Trump, this embargo was severely tightened. And the other thing that happened, Cuba was labeled as a terrorist nation. And let me be very clear. Cuba is not a military threat to any nation. And that designation of being a terrorist nation has had a disastrous effect because financial institutions, banks, will not make capital available to any country labeled terrorist. That makes it seem like it is a tremendous threat and not a stable investment. So between the tightened embargo, the designation as a terrorist nation, and COVID had a disastrous effect on the economy of Cuba. 70% of the tourist industry dried up, and Cuba is very dependent on tourism for its capital. So I will tell you, Cubans are suffering. And it is visible when you are a visitor in Cuba. Cubans receive ration cards so that there is not hunger in Cuba, but to receive their allotted bread, chicken, milk, and other types of food, they very often have to wait in line because supply is limited. There are long gas lines because gas is limited. In the countryside, electricity sometimes goes out. There are blackouts. So the Cuban people are suffering more intensely right now than they have in a long time. And one of the very sad things to share is that there are Cubans leaving Cuba. But, and this is a big but, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of all these problems, Cuba has a vibrant culture, and I'm going to take you on that trip right now. There are no billboards in Cuba except this one billboard, which is in Revolutionary Square, which is the large gathering area in Havana. And this sign reads, "Cuba lives and breathes." And the symbol of Cuba is a newborn baby in the hands of a nurse. This is their message to the world. Cuba lives and breathes. We started our visit to Cuba by going to Old Havana. And there are three main squares in Old Havana. We started in the Military Square. The statue that you see in the left-hand corner is of a man who was a plantation owner in Cuba, freed his slaves, and fought very hard for the independence of Cuba. So in the square, they pay him honor. In the lower left corner is a statue of Jesus. And what our guide pointed out to us, that is visible when you're in Old Havana looking out at the harbor toward an island. The statue was on the island. And he asked us to pay attention to the facial characteristics of this Jesus because he is of mixed race. And I took a photo of this woman standing on top of this monument, and she is looking out to the ocean to watch for her returning husband. There's a photo of a Cuban fort, which is still there today. And when we look to the right, you see a photo that is quite recognizable to us. Looks very much like the capital of the United States. And I took that photo from the first night we were in Cuba having a drink on top of a hotel, and that shows one of the scenes. This is the religious square in Cuba, and you can see the cathedral in the right-hand corner. And right in front, there is a building that is a very famous cafe, but there are no tables set because there are not that many tourists. If you look in the lower pictures, that's the streets of Old Havana. And if you look at those restaurants that are in the street, you will see lots of vacant seats because tourism is very much down. When I was there in 2016, this area was crawling with tourists. We stopped in Old Havana to have a meal at this restaurant called the Mojita. And there I am, front and center, with Cuban musicians behind me, and I am drinking a mojito, one of the symbols of Cuban culture. And if we look up, you'll see an espresso. Cubans love strong black coffee and lots and lots of sugar. So those are two very common things in Cuba. I always love to take pictures of these villas in Cuba where very rich people lived in the past, and now they are occupied by regular people living in apartments, and you can tell that they're regular people because their laundry is hanging out to dry in the Cuban sun. This is Revolutionary Square. And in the left-hand corner, that is Martí. José Martí is one of the inspirations for Cuban independence. He was a poet, a warrior, an author, and an inspiration to all of Cuba. Throughout Cuba, you will see statues of José Martí. The next two really works of art depicting two of the heroes of the Cuban Revolution. The first, very recognizable, Che Guevara. And the one to the right is Camillo. Camillo died in his 20s in an airplane crash. They were two of the people that were in charge of part of the military things that went on during the revolution. And over to the left is a statue with José Martí in front of it. In Old Havana, we visited the art gallery, a very renowned professor and artist. And forgive me if I mispronounce, I don't speak Spanish, isn't that awful? Nelson Dominique is a very famous Cuban author, artist. You enter his house into a courtyard, which is the middle picture, with sculptures and plants everywhere. And you go up these steep stairs to his apartment where he lives and to his gallery. If you look at these paintings, they have a tremendous amount of violence in them. And he talked to us about hope, and he talked to us about a pandemic. And he said, I'm not talking about a pandemic of COVID. I am talking about a pandemic of violence. This is another scene in his apartment. He works in many different mediums. He paints, he does ceramic sculpture, he does two-dimensional art, three-dimensional art. There's a sculpture in the lower corner. And I was amused by his lovers in the time of COVID. We visited the gallery and home of two other famous artists in Cuba. They're both professors and artists who exhibit in many places beyond Cuba. This is Alicia Leal, and this is some of her artwork. A statue which looks like she usually focuses on women in her artwork. And that is a photo of her with us wandering around her gallery. And in the right-hand corner, I was very interested in this creation. She did it for a celebration of Havana, and it shows women, and it shows a sewing machine. And she talked about the great importance of a sewing machine, bringing in extra income to the family, sewing the clothes that a family wears, and that the women hold a community together with the threads with which they sew. And in this artwork, you will see various threads and the portraits of women throughout. It's a very interesting creation. And this is her husband, and he made it very clear that he works in organic forms that are sexual. So you don't need a lot of imagination to look at what he is creating. And he creates big paintings in bright colors. We visited another artist who works in three-dimensional portraits that are carved in wood. And his subjects are always the common Cuban laborer. He says that is the backbone of Cuba. I really loved his artwork. Now, there is fine arts in Cuba, and there is community art. And this was a community that we visited where the people that live in this community cleared out a garbage dump and created a cultural center for art, music, and the community gathering. And you will see various creations that have been made by artists and by people in the community, sculptures, mosaics, and the sculpture that announces Morleando shows heroes of the Cuban Revolution. Here's another shot where we walked up the hill and you get the feeling of this lovely creation. In the left-hand corner, you see a man who was he's a professor and also a member of this community that took this project on, and he talked to us about an elder woman that lived in the community named Elena. He said Elena sat on a rock, and people would say, "Elena, what are you waiting for?" And she would say, "I'm waiting for a lover." And he said after she died, they created this mosaic bench with her name on it and with the message that all of us should be looking for love throughout our lives. Next to Elena's bench is an egg. This egg is created out of nuts and bolts and pieces of what was left in this garbage dump to create this egg. If you move to the right, you see Charlie Chaplin made out of paper mache. And if you go under Charlie Chaplin, you will see various sculptures. The music scene, there is an area for musicians to perform and for dancing. And this has music several nights of the week for the community. And Now, this is another example of community art. It's called Fusterlandia. It is a cultural mosaic community project created by the artist Jose Fuster. Fuster created an art park in his community, and then people came to him and said, why don't you do the school? Why don't you do the clinic? And then people would say, Fuster, I want you to mosaic my house and make it beautiful. So these are some examples of his mosaic works. And right in the middle, you again see the sewing machine, and this time with a heart under it. And here are some other of his creations. Music is very central to all of Cuba. So you see a musician, and he does a lot of split faces and a family gathering. And in the lower corner on the right, you see a house that he mosaicked. There are many institutions in Cuba to maintain the arts and expose people to the arts. This is called Casa de las Americas. It's a major cultural institution, and it brings together art from all of Latin America. And the man who established this was a survivor of the Moncada. The Moncada was one of the first attempts to overthrow Batista. It didn't work. Several people were killed, and others were jailed. Fidel Castro was there. He was jailed after that. This was a survivor of the Moncada who went on to help create this cultural institution. This is a place where there are art exhibits from all over Latin America. This woman is rather cut off. She is an author from one of the Latin America countries who's visiting, and he talked to us. This was, the next photo is really of pop art. A man who was called Raul Martinez, and you'll see his work in many other slides. And the last slide on the right was a slide made by an Ecuadorian. He said to the Vietnam War, it's all done in abstracts. And over on the left is a sculpture that was, it goes from the floor to the ceiling in this big lecture hall, and it was donated by Mexico. There are lectures in this institution where artists from all over Latin America come to give lectures. Writers come to share their work. Artists have art exhibits here. This is a cultural space to connect to all of Latin America. We then visited the National Union of Writers and Artists. And in the lower left corner, you see the actual building, and next to it, the sculpture that is in front of the steps to the building. The first room that we entered had a whole collection of periodicals that exist in Cuba. These are literary periodicals, and there was a whole exhibit of books that have been written and are being written in Cuba. What was interesting in touring this facility is that there were artists gathered together who were working on things. This was downstairs where there was an art exhibit, and the woman that you see in the right-hand corner at the top is a famous art critic in Cuba. She talked to us about how difficult it is for Cuban artists to get exhibitions in the United States. And she talked about those difficulties. We went to a ceramic museum in Havana, and it was filled with beautiful ceramic creations of cups and plates and platters and bowls and vases, just beautiful work from all different periods of Cuban artists. And there were also sculptures. I wish in the far right corner there is a sculpture which depicts slavery. I wish that I could make it larger for you. It was a very moving and upsetting piece of sculpture, showing the torture and the silence that slaves experienced. Again, in the left-hand corner, we see the sewing machine. And in this sewing machine, the handle lever of the sewing machine is a human hand sewing the Cuban flag. I was intrigued by this ceramic creation, a very textured vase on a wooden structure held up by spikes. And in the right-hand corner, you see what we are told is a constant Cuban experience, standing in line. These are ceramic figures. The artist placed himself in this, his family, his neighbors, because the experience of standing in line is a daily experience for Cubans, waiting for a bus, waiting for bread, waiting for chicken, waiting for gas. Now, this is, we are at the Fine Arts Museum, and here I need to give an explanation and an apology. We were going to spend the large part of a whole afternoon in this incredible museum with a guide to talk about the various periods of Cuban art and the various artists, but we had a tremendous tropical storm when we were in Cuba, which grounded us. In fact, the storm was severe enough that there were 3 deaths that happened in Havana. The streets of Havana flooded, and 1 car was swept away, and another person had a heart attack. So we only got to go to this museum on our very last day, and we only got to spend an hour in this museum, which cannot do justice to it. So I had my camera, I just took pictures. It is a shame never to share with you the names of the artists and to tell you the period and hopefully to tell you something about their work. I do know the name of this artist. He was the pop artist that you saw in the Casa de las Americas. His name is Raul Martinez. And in this piece, he shows heroes of the revolution. He shows you Jose Martinez, but he also shows you Jose Marti, and he shows you regular Cubans. And there's a woman with her cat in the middle. I really love his art for the color and for the depiction of Cubans. Now we see in the left-hand upper corner, this was from the period in which Cuba was really suffering, and it shows a woman sewing who looks like she is very close to death, worn out by labor at the sewing machine. You see death touching her. In the lower corner, there is a depiction of the violence and the pain that Cuba experienced in their many struggles for independence. And I put this painting at the right end to show you the modern art influence in Cuba. In the left-hand corner, I was very moved by this piece of sculpture because the lines in this piece of sculpture are very simple, and yet they emote tremendous pain and sadness. And these are just snapshots I took of other works of art. In the right-hand corner, you see the beautiful female form, and under that, you see a slave ship, and you see someone being thrown overboard. Wherever you go in Cuba, the period of slavery is acknowledged. It is depicted in artwork, and it is depicted in other ways, and it is talked about. I love the depiction of the worker in the left-hand upper corner, a laborer whose tool is the paintbrush. And to the far right, you see a photo of, not a photo, it's a painting of tremendous poverty and pain and starvation that existed in Cuba before the revolution. I am not sure who this artist is, but there is a very famous artist who is Chinese and Cuban. I mean, he tells you he's Cuban, 100% Cuban, with Chinese background. And I think these could be two of his works, but I'm not absolutely sure, and I don't want to be wrong. This is a depiction of, in the left-hand corner, depiction of a dictator dictating to the herd. And in the middle, you have what happens in that period under dictatorship when you are a protester. And on the walls, there were skulls of cows that depicted all the African countries with a design that each African country is known for. The one in the lower left is Angola, and the one to the right is the Congo. This is a memorial that we went to, which is a memorial to all the Cubans who have been victims of terrorism on Cuba. You enter this memorial where there are 3,000 crosses that represent the 3,000 people killed in terrorist attempts on Cuba. And this is a document, a CIA document that was declassified, which refers to, and I can read part of it to you, it talks about a plan that they had. The plan authorized reasonably calculated efforts to. The plan required that actions taken during Phase 1 should be consistent with overt policies of isolating Castro in the Western Hemisphere. This is the goal of the CIA and the goal of the United States government. And they point out that it should be undertaken in such a way to permit the U.S. disengagement with minimal losses of assets and prestige. You do remember that Cuba was invaded after they had won their independence in the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which Cubans living in Miami did a military action to try and reclaim Cuba with support of the U.S. This was rather eerie. We walked over all these bullets and canisters, explosive canisters, and there was a message on the wall that there were 581 terrorist attacks aimed at Cuban missions and personnel stationed overseas. And in the upper right corner, it shows you a plane which represents the plane that was bombed by the CIA. There was an operation called Operation Peter Pan. Affluent people and middle-class people in Cuba were terrified about what was going to happen to their children under this new government. So there was a mass exodus of 14,000 children ages 6 to 18 from Cuba to the U.S., from 60 to 62. And these are pictures of the children leaving Cuba. And the lower left corner shows you a child's train with their toys as they are leaving Cuba. I met people that had been involved in Operation Peter Pan. For some people, they were sent to the U.S. sometimes to family that lived in the U.S., but many times to foster care. And some of those situations worked, and some of them were very painful experience for the children that were sent in Operation Peter Pan. Now, this is a picture of the Mariel boat project where people want to leave Cuba. Take whatever boats you have, go ahead, head for Miami. Anybody that wants to can leave. And 125,000 people did leave Cuba. This, to the right, this is an artistic representation of the going and the coming, the leaving and the coming back, the experience that has been a very Cuban experience. Here's a summary of some of the terrorism that was inflicted on Cuba. Numerous attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs actual invasion of Cuba to try and defeat the revolution. And then the CIA blew up a Cubana airline going from Barbados to Havana, killing 73 people, including the youth champion fencing team. There were many bombings of Cuban hotels as a way of discouraging tourism, to make it dangerous to go to Cuba. And there were many efforts to spread biological terrorism, a fungus on tobacco, and disease to pig farms. And there were photos of these efforts, but it was in an area that was very dark, very difficult to get photos. And if you have a sense of humor, may you enjoy the next thing we visited. It's called the Fidel Castro Center. Now, Fidel Castro made it very clear. He did not want a memorial. He did not want a museum. He did not want a library. He wanted to be remembered for the things he accomplished. He did not want to be deified. And so a guide stood in front of this building and said, "This is not a museum, this is not a library, this is not a memorial." Fidel Castro did not want sculptures or memorials or monuments to him. And here he is as an old man looking rather askance at a bronze sculpture of his face. In the right-hand corner is a photo of Fidel with political messages all over his face. And in the lower left-hand corner, another creation from the pop artist with Jose Marti at the center holding white roses. He wrote a beautiful poem called The White Rose. And Fidel is on one side of him, and and Che Guevara on the other. I was rather intrigued with this because this shows you photos of Fidel Castro at various ages. In the lower left-hand corner, clearly he is not a child that was raised in poverty. You can tell by the outfit he has on, his haircut. And in the right-hand corner, you see him at another age wearing a sailor suit. In the left corner, you see him wearing a military uniform, which is the place where he went to school. And in the center, you see him as a mature adult leading Cuba. Under that, you see him as a revolutionary struggling for the freedom of Cuba. And in the right-hand corner, that is either him as a young lawyer practicing law in Cuba or when he was released from prison. I'm not sure which. In the left-hand corner, you see Fidel as an old man surrounded by his sons. He had 5 sons. He is surrounded by 4 of them. One of them is a photographer taking the photo. He kept his private life very private. And in the middle frame, you see him playing baseball. He loved baseball. Cubans love baseball. Each area of Cuba has their own team, and they are very competitive. In the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, that is Cubans, the people that were involved in the uprising at Moncada being released from prison. And under it, you see Fidel driving a Jeep, I suspect during the revolution. Okay, we look at these gorgeous 1950 vehicles. I asked about the red and white car because I learned to drive on a car that looked just like that. And I said, "What year is that Chevy?" And he said, our guide rolled his eyes and said, "It's a 1954 Chevy, but it is not a 1954 Chevy. It is a car that has been maintained with parts created by the creative Cubans." Actually, all of these cars, they had no place to get parts for any of these. They created the parts, and they have kept these vehicles going. It really is an attestation. It shows you the determination and skill of the Cubans. And of course, they are very popular with tourists. I have a neighbor who is very much into his Cadillac. And so I wanted to get a photo of a 1950s Cadillac, but I had to settle for a Bonneville Pontiac. But I was not riding in that bright pink car. If you look at the back of that picture, you will see a blue school bus. We were riding on a blue school bus. We stayed in the right-hand upper corner. You see a photo of where we stayed. We stayed at the Martin Luther King Center, which I would describe very much as a hostel, bunk beds, and wonderful food that is cooked very simply in the kitchen. The rooms were on the second floor. It is very modest, and it's wonderful because you are right in the midst of a Cuban community, and people come to meet you and greet you. It's really a lovely place to stay. And when we were staying at the Martin Luther King Center, they wanted us to visit an elder center in the neighborhood. And we arrived, if you look at the left-hand upper corner, we arrived when they were being led in exercises, pointing out that you, in old age, you must keep moving. We then gathered with them where we had some refreshments, and they shared their experiences of what that elder center means to them in breaking down their isolation and giving them a social life and giving them purpose to go on. One of the women in the group in the lower left corner said, "I want somebody to tell me what it was like before the revolution." This man stood up and he gave the most eloquent speech from his own experience. He said there were no roads, there were no schools, there were no doctors, there was hunger. He talked about how his mother would cook up green mangoes so that they would have something in their stomach. And he had actually fought in the revolution and had tremendous anger over the people that didn't support it. He called them bandits. That's what they were, bandits. He was a very sweet old man, and he gave such a testimony to what Cuba has accomplished. And he so inspired, this other man stood up and also gave testimony. We traveled to some other cities. Here are a few photos of the city Cienfuegos, located in south central Cuba. And it has a malecón. You can see I was going to say pine tree, not a pine tree, a palm tree. And it has a seawall, and there is the ocean. The red domed building was in the square of Cienfuegos, and there were museums that we went into that had very ornate furniture and artwork showing the wealth that was accumulated by the colonists who lived in other periods in Cuba. And the upper right-hand corner, we stayed in the homes of people who fed us incredibly well, and I took a picture of the little area on the patio where we ate. We then went on to Trinidad. Trinidad was settled in the 1500s, known as the Center for United Fruit. And we were able to, it's known for its very grand colonial buildings showing the wealth of the Spanish, and cobblestone streets. Now, these cobblestone streets are made out of rounded stones. They're not easy to walk on, I will attest to that. But the tremendous wealth that you see was generated by the sugarcane industry and the slave trade. And when you go into their museums, the building in the lower left was actually a museum showing the elegant way that the Spanish people who owned plantations lived, very ornate, but in the same area, they would show you depictions of slavery. And that, you see the two photos, another rendition of a slave ship and how many people were crowded in together when they were brought to Cuba. And this is punishment that was used for slaves, and there actually was dried blood on that stock. You see horses and buggies drawn in Trinidad. You see them throughout Cuba, but in this area, you see them a great deal. we visited a film school, the San Antonio International Film School, which takes people from all of Latin America. You have to have completed 3 years of college in order to come to the film school, and they work on movies, TV, video. There is lots and lots of equipment, and they made a joke that they made this film studio to be in the countryside where the young students would not be distracted by city living. We then visited in the countryside a place called the Theater of the Elements. And we were first, when we got off our bus, walked down this little country path, we came to what we were not sure in the top left-hand corner was a person or sculpture. Turned out this was an actor in front of a standard Cuban country home, and he acted out a folktale for us, the folktale of how coffee was discovered, the magic coffee bean. And in the middle screen, you see a structure which is actually a performance structure and an art gallery. And the artist who we had visited in Havana, Nelson Dominique, had an exhibit in this art gallery. And we were treated to a young actor who did a puppet show for us. In going from right to left, you see a woman dancing. That woman did a dance to one of the African goddesses in the African religions that are still practiced in Cuba, and it was a very impassioned dance. And wherever you are in Cuba, there is always music. And this is a young man playing a guitar who accompanied some of the presentations. And that was, the woman dancing, that was in an outdoor area where there are performances that are put on for people in the countryside. And when we move to the left, you see a band playing. All these young people are actors, musicians, and dancers. And they entertained us with their music, and we had and people danced, and then we had a delightful meal. One of the other things that happens at the Theater of the Elements, and I was so taken by what was going on that I didn't take pictures. They do what they call playback theater. And so they asked if there was anything that happened on our travels that they could act out. And so one of the elder men on our trip had fallen in the middle of the night when we were in one of the cities that we visited, and he really did a job on his ear. He lacerated his ear. And so he got to experience the Cuban medical system for real, the emergency system. He was taken to an emergency clinic where he was taken very good care of, and his ear was sewed back together. They acted out this whole scene from the surprise of the injury to the shock and trauma of the injury to sewing it back up and putting him back together in one piece. They also asked if anybody had ever been to Cuba before, and I said I had, and they wanted to know what I liked about it. And then the man who was leading this said, "What didn't you like?" And I told them I was distressed by the number of Cubans that want to leave. And these young actors acted out this scene with a white, red, and blue scarf, pulling it this way and that way, showing the total agony of leaving, the conflict, whether to stay, whether to go, the pulling back and forth, an experience that is very Cuban. One of the things that first of all, to the left, we went to a beautiful theater in Havana and saw a professional modern dance performance that was absolutely wonderful. I don't know if people are familiar with Martha Graham, how she created dance and did it in cloth so that she created dance that turned into sculpture. They used a similar technique with many people and created not only dance, but sculptures in dance. It was a wonderful performance. One of the things that the Cubans believe very strongly in is supporting the arts for young people. They have specialized schools for dance and music. The dance school we did visit, but it was during that horrendous downpour, tropical storm, and most of the students were not there that day. So we did not get treated to a dance performance, but we heard about their program. And in order to be in one of these specialized schools for dance or music, you have to be academically achieving. You have to be in good academic standing. And you have to be willing to go to a very long day of school. Our guide's daughter is in a specialized dance school. She leaves at 6 o'clock in the morning and does not get home till 7 at night. We actually met her, and she was just bouncing with joy and enthusiasm about the school that she goes to, because half of the day is academics. And so it elongates the school day when you have the specialized either music or dance. These two photos show a visit that we took to a school of music. And the far left, we were treated to several pieces of classical music, were absolutely lovely by the students. And the middle photo is a photo of two young men doing jazz, which is my favorite. And it was wonderful. It was just wonderful. It was inspirational, as they say. Now, dance is everywhere in Cuba and is a great big part of their culture. When we went to a restaurant, there was a combo there playing music. There is always music playing and dancing. And the lower picture is from Orlando, and it shows some of the people dancing who were on our trip and people from the community dancing. And this woman, if I move from left to right, the third picture shows one of the women in our trip dancing with an elderly woman who had many dance moves and was very proud of her dancing and very enjoyable. And the picture up above is of a dance hall in the Martin Luther King neighborhood around the corner. And it's not a youthful place. The people that were dancing here were middle-aged and older, and this was a weeknight, and they were out there dancing their stuff. In fact, the lower right-hand corner shows two of the women that were having just a great time dancing. This is a culture that dances. They dance again and again and again. Dancing is a very strong part of their culture. The next place that we went to was a new experience for me in going to Cuba. This was called the Art Factory, a large series of warehouses that contain avant-garde art, music, dance, all kinds of performances, and it's a very stylish, hip youth scene. And you'll see there's a picture of Joni Mitchell. They had other American artists' posters on the wall. That is how we entered, and you enter, there's artwork everywhere. The third picture was under a sculpture where couples and friends were drinking and conversing with each other, and the right-hand picture is a art rendition of dancers. Here's some of the artwork, sculpture. The depiction of the couples on the wall, which gives you a feeling of all the varieties of couples that exist in Cuba, young and old, people, the rainbow of colors, straight people, gay people. It's all there, all in the name of love. And in if we look at the artwork under those photographs, it reminds me of The Scream. This man is reading the newspaper in horror. And then that's a portrait of a man. And I can't begin to explain this as a religious figure sitting next to a person covered in feathers. I heard African chanting, and there was rustling in the room, and people were rushing to get seats. So I sat down where I was, and it was incredible chanting. And this man came in chanting and dancing, and he leaped onto that structure. He was accompanied by a cello player, a young man that you see in the upper right-hand corner. And here is a painting that was on the wall. I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen, but there was like tension and excitement in the room. And then it turned into a fashion show of women in gowns and bathing suits, and men in dresses, and women in unisex outfits. It was an experience I had not had before in Cuba, and you would have thought you were in a stylish club in New York City. Now here we see some of the dancing, and you can see that this is a youthful audience, and you can see their very stylish haircuts. The woman in the lower corner was one of the women on our trip, so she's older than the young people. But dance, the Cubans will. Dance, dance, dance. This shows the participants on this cultural trip. We are by the Malecón in Havana, the seawall that goes around it, a gathering for families and lovers. And in the upper middle photo, we are in front of the Fidel Castro Center. And over here, we are visiting the film school in the countryside. I dedicate this trip to my good friend Alberto Gonzalez, who is a translator. He translated for Fidel. He translated for groups that came to the United States, so he actually has even been to my house, a very special human being. What I want to conclude with, Cuba is under stress. Cuba is feeling economic stress. And Cuba has a vibrant culture that is very alive. Dance, music, theater, movies, plays, it is all there. A wonderful trip. Thank you.